the housing, the food, the fund runs, morale, events, the laundry, all of it. She was responsible for all that. And it was a notoriously poorly run sort of thing. Before, apparently previous bosses had been fired. She's an A-type, high performer, super ambitious, got promoted the latest zone, to get promoted early, and she says, I'm gonna fix it. Student of leadership, read everything, knew everything, and she was gonna be the one who's gonna fix it. And she did the exact same thing. I'm gonna go in there and inspire my people. And it wasn't working. She pushed harder to inspire her people. And it wasn't working. And for the first 6 months of her being around, she went together when I was on the city. Because she was failing. She didn't know what to do. Everything she tried wasn't working. Reports that she didn't take her seriously, they obeying her, and it was really bad. And so 6 months in, she gave up. She literally gave up. She accepted the fact that she wouldn't be the success that she set out to be. But she was stuck there for another 6 months. And she figured, even though I don't want to be here, I regret everything. I'm stuck here, so I failed. I might as well use my time to at least help them enjoy the time I can. Because they're also away from their families and they don't have to work. So I'm going to devote all my time not to succeed in inspiring them. I'm going to devote all my time to ensure that they enjoy their day and they get the most out of their day. It's changed things. All of a sudden, increased morale, increased trust, increased took care of each other, performance increased. And by the end, she was a huge success and the love of community that that group will have each other was cool. It was the way to inspire. So I think to inspire someone is a funny thing to do. But I want to say to take care of someone.
like kaso ay mo kulit ang
somewhat selfishly sounding thing. We forget that leadership is really about service. And inspiration is about service.
narinig ka dito.
The service part is the important part. It's the other person that's the receiving. I keep telling you everything you want to hear, but you're not listening. That's the problem. You're not hearing. All talk. So a lot of ways I parent my kids. I don't do a lot of teaching or preaching. It's all by example. And I do a whole lot more listening. It's sort of like 90-10 or 95-5. I'm just listening. I'm just there. And I'm caring. And I'm truly loving them. And it's also custom made, right? Like, so the son needs a little something that the who probably was, type A, very organized, had a plan. Sometimes you got to make a new plan. That's not working. I learned from a Marine is no plan ever succeeds contact with the enemy. And I think it's the same in business, which is no plan ever goes according to plan. So it's like if that's all you got, it's, there's an adaptability. It's not that we should have no plan. That we should learn to be adaptable and understand things change. But vulnerability doesn't mean crying. It doesn't mean like I suck. That's not what vulnerability means. Vulnerability means admitting I made a mistake. Vulnerability means admitting I didn't expect to ever succeed to this level. I don't know that this is beyond my skill set. Vulnerability means admitting that I'm scared or uncertain or confused. And we call it vulnerability because you risk humiliation, and if you're an employee, you risk getting fired. In some poorly run organizations, where admitting mistakes or admitting vulnerability literally puts you at risk, which is madness. That's a poorly run organization.
Well, that's the thing that boggles my mind too, right? Like, whether it's a head football coach or military leader, like, do we all want to live in a world that we're not able to make a mistake or two? Do we all want to live in a world, or do we actually live in this world where the leader doesn't make mistakes? Are we kidding ourselves?
And this is the folly of leadership. And this is why we call somebody leader, by the way, not because they're at the top of the organization. Like, I know many people who sit at the highest levels of organizations who aren't leaders. They have authority, and that's why we do as they tell us, but we wouldn't follow them. The reason we call someone leader is because they're the one with the courage to take the risk to do the vulnerable thing first, to go into a direction that may fail, to admit that they need help, to admit that they made a mistake. That act is an act of leadership. It's one of the greatest acts of leadership there is. And when we demonstrate, when we lead and express our ability, then guess what everybody else does? They do the same thing. I learned this lesson the hard way. I thought nobody wanted to help me. The reason is because I never asked for help or admitted that I needed it. The minute I was willing to admit that I don't know what I'm doing, I have huge gaping blind spots and holes in my skill set, as soon as I admitted those things, people rushed to help me. The reason they didn't offer or help before is because they didn't think I needed it, because I was the one busy lying, hiding, and faking, pretending that I knew all the answers. It was my fault, not theirs.
Yeah.
It wasn't the lack of available help. It was my resistance to admitting that I needed it.
What's that song that Sting wrote a while back? That fish out of water, it flaps away from the helping hands. And the irony is, right, like, all it needs is those hands to put it back into the water, and yet it flops away. And that's, I think, it's ironic, right?
It depends how it lands on dry land. Up to dry land. But or as well.
In many ways, I feel the same way. When I feel the most scared, I want to go into a shell. I don't want it. What I need.
Which is why the single most valuable characteristic of leadership is courage.
Yeah. I've appreciated this enlightening talk about inspiration, and it also kind of strikes a spiritual chord that I remember from another discussion, which I talked to Bethany Hamilton. Do you know who Bethany is?
I don't.
Bethany, we made a record called Soul Surfer, and Bethany's a professional surfer, and she lost her arm in a shark attack.
Oh, I remember. Yeah.
Yeah, and within, I think, a couple of months, maybe a month.
And she's amazing.
She's back.
She's young.
Yeah, she was
incredible.
13 or 14.
Yeah.
And within a month, after getting her arm bitten off by a tiger shark, she's back in the water surfing, right? And I talked to her about how she was able to do this, and it's a lot of the same kind of conversations about courage. It also kind
And
of
support. I bet she had a remarkable support system in her family and friends that helped her find the courage.
Yeah.
It wasn't some. Again, I go back to my previous point. It wasn't some deep internal fortitude that she did all by herself. There was a support structure of people who loved and cared about her and encouraged her and were there for her and said, whether you do, whether you don't, we will support you, regardless of your decision. We got you, I'll go with you. I'll be by your side. All of that gives us the courage.
Yeah. What should we do if we're on the receiving end of this new inspiration? It's hard sometimes, right? If we, there's all kinds of layers of, oh, she doesn't deserve that, or he, I'm better than he is, and so there's this kind of from the bottom up kind of pride, if you will.
I tend to find that those kinds of points of view and dispositions tend to be in poorly led groups. There's more gossip in politics in a poorly led organization than in a well-led organization. In a well-led organization, people take joy and pride in the success of things. if anything, they don't recognize they want to distribute and give it away. And there's an excessive amount of like, it's really not me, you know? You find that.
Well,
But if there's a lot of that, I don't actually look at the people I'm looking at who's leading those people.
Yeah.
If that is pervasive.
Yeah, and I don't know a lot about what Elon is doing, but I see him making lots of mistakes in public, and you know, I see a lot of transparency. I don't know if it's 100%, but it seems like he and his people are not afraid to do stuff that might not work, right? And so, how can we, if we're on the, what can be our mindset? How can we change the paradigm? How can we think differently? Because all these years, right, we've been taught to, you know, to kill the leader so that we can become the leader, right? To do whatever we can to get what we need. Right?
Yeah.
But this is totally different.
Well, I mean, you're pointing to the exact that business practices that we consider quote unquote normal today are not normal. They're 90s. The concept of shareholder supremacy was a theory proposed in the late 1970s. Right? The idea of using mass layoffs to balance the books did not exist in the United States prior to the 1980s. The whole idea of rank and yank and pitting your people against competing with each other as opposed to competing against each other. Right? These were all proposed and popularized in the boom years of the 80s and 90s. This is not a Republican or Democrat thing, because you had Republicans and a Democrat in presidency in those years. They were boom years. It was a kinder, gentler Cold War. You weren't hiding them, you know, running drills to hide under our desks. It was a relatively peaceful time. Those times are gone. These are not boom years anymore. These are not kinder, gentler years. We are in a world of global tension, and those theories just are outdated. And companies that think that those ideas, the concepts of shareholder supremacy, you know, putting the interest of a disinterested external constituent ahead of people inside, that's like a coach prioritizing the needs of the fans over the players. It's madness. Using mass layoffs to balance the books, which in one decision destroys trust and cooperation amongst a group and encourages self-interest and selfishness and building of walls and lack of vulnerability and lack of courage, right? We have to undo these theories. We have to undo them. We have to go back to a time where proper leadership, good long-term effective leadership, existed. That's all of my work is devoted to undoing the madness from the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're working on the leaders, and that's great. How can I, as a follower, be a good follower?
To me, leadership is not position and rank, right? There's nothing to do with rank. Leadership is the decision to take care of the person to the left of me and to take care of the person to the right. That's what leadership is. And the best leaders are actually the best followers. The best leaders see themselves in service to a cause bigger than themselves. And when you ask them, are you a leader, they will see themselves as servants devoted to some higher calling. And so you keep saying to me, oh, but what about the rest of us? Well, no. I don't necessarily think someone would rank as a leader. In fact, look at public companies. You know, they claim to be leaders, and yet they do what a 27-year-old analyst who is putting his self-interest ahead of the interest of the company. They're doing what that analyst community is telling them to do. That's not leadership.